Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this lunchtime presentation by Chris Stone, the president of the Open Society Foundations. You probably have wondered about the title, Corruption, Grant Corruption and Philanthropy. It's a very curious combination of terms because corruption, and certainly grant corruption, is immediately thought of in very negative terms, and then we have philanthropy, and the opposite happens, right? You think of it in normally very positive terms. So if you have something very negative and something very positive, all in the same title, why that is the case, I think Chris will enlighten us on that point. I'm especially pleased to have Chris speak on that topic because both corruption and philanthropy are of concern here at the school, right? We have with Alina Pipiti, a faculty member who works on corruption and has a major project funded by the European Union on that very topic. And we also have here at the school an interest in philanthropy. We have a new professor, Joanna Mayer. She joined us last fall, and philanthropy, social entrepreneurship is one of her topics, and as you know, it is also one of mine. We will start here at the school a project that looks at the role of foundations in Germany, so the contributions philanthropic foundations have made or are making to this country. We looked at that very much in the European perspective, and that complements a project that I completed just about a year ago on the role of foundations in America. And it's a project under the very, I think, telling title called A Versatile Institution, right? A comparative history of American philanthropy. So that's all a long way of telling you that the topic of today's lunchtime presentation is of great interest to the school. And it leaves me to now introduce Chris. Chris is, as said, the president of the Open Society Foundations and relatively recently appointed, and before he took on this very challenging task, was at Harvard. And at Harvard he ran a number of institutions over the years, and most importantly, I think from our perspective, he was the director of the Hauser Center for Non-Profit Organizations, which is one of the leading centers when it comes to the study of not-for-profit organizations and philanthropy in this country. And it was indeed in that capacity that we met some time ago while I was still at UCLA, and you had just moved to the Hauser Center, and we could compare notes what it means to run centers on non-profits and philanthropy, and here we are in very different parts of the world, both of us. But before joining the Hauser Center, Chris was at Harvard in various capacities, typically in relating to criminal justice. He's also, as you know, a professor of criminal justice there. He worked on what I found very, very interesting. You were awarded the Honorary Order of the British Empire for your contributions to criminal justice reform in the United Kingdom, and that's indeed a very, very good honor to have. Chris has a BA from Harvard, an MPhil in criminology from Cambridge, and a JD from Yale. And what we will do is we ask Chris to come to the podium now. He will speak for about 30 minutes. That gives us enough time for a Q&A. And unfortunately, Chris has to leave by about 1:45 to catch a flight. I don't know where, but I think it's far away. But it's the opposite direction, not going back to the States, but I think you're traveling east to Baku, if I remember correctly. Kabul, to Kabul. Good luck with that. But so let me welcome and Chris, and we all look very much forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Helmut, and thank you all for being here. I don't know if I'll go half an hour, but at least maybe 20 minutes, and then I hope we can have some discussion together. This is a topic I'm grateful for the chance to talk with you about, and I'm just at the beginning of sorting through my own views about it, and would welcome a conversation. Students of statistics are reminded, usually at the beginning of a class on statistics, about the famous British quip that there are three kinds of lies in the world: lies, damned lies, and statistics. And the reason that we teach that to students of statistics is not because we think they are taking a class in lying, but because we want to remind them that while statistics can be a great conveyor of facts, many people suspect that statistics are in fact used to lie and mislead, and that the quip carries that forward, essentially telling them, statisticians, beware. I want to make a similar point about philanthropy, more specifically about the private funding of civil society organizations. My point is not that philanthropy is necessarily corrupt, but that while philanthropy can be an invaluable supporter of social engagement, of democratic practice, there are those who think of philanthropy as a form of corruption and a way of undermining democratic practice. And in the same sense, philanthropists need to beware of this perception and this possibility. That subject about the possibility of philanthropy being a form of corruption and the dangers that implies is particularly important today as we see a proliferation of laws around the world restricting, or some would say repressing, NGO and civil society activity in many countries. And it's not just the problem of Putin's anti-NGO laws and the inspections being carried out as we speak here of NGOs looking for NGOs serving as foreign agents in Russia. So there are new laws in India, in Zambia, in other countries that warn us that the regulation of NGOs in this way is a growing phenomenon in democratic as well as authoritarian countries, and we ought to pay attention to what's happening. So let me discuss three stories, or tell you three stories, share three stories with you briefly, and then maybe we can have a conversation together. The first is a story of philanthropy's battle against corruption. The second is the story of the growing regulation of philanthropy and funding of civil society as a form of corruption. And the third is a story of maybe some clues about a future story of the role and power of civil society in modern politics. So the first story, philanthropy as a force against corruption. One of the greatest or most dangerous forms of grand corruption today and for many decades, and if not centuries, has been the payment by mining and oil companies to governments and individual officials from time to time for the right to extract oil and minerals from resource-rich territories. These payments may or may not themselves be intended as a form of corruption, but when they are made secretly, they invite the governments and the officials to cart them off and keep them to themselves and treat them as a direct form of grand corruption and bribery. And it's, as a result, we have today, if you take the example of Equatorial Guinea, a country which by GDP or simply revenues should be among the middle-income countries of the world, instead a country of desperate poverty and wealth hidden and kept by a very small number of the ruling elite. That pattern recurs all over the world. And in 2010, the United States Congress, in adopting a regulation, an act regulating the financial industry known as the Dodd-Frank Act, included in that piece of legislation a provision known for the Senate sponsors of the amendment to the act, the Cardin-Lugar Amendment, which requires industries, requires actually the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, to adopt regulations that would require publicly listed companies in the United States to disclose the payments to governments and government officials, project by project, not just country by country. A huge fight over what the definition of a project is, but we can let that pass for the sake of this story. Project by project, payments, individual payments, anything in six figures or above. The industry fought that. The mining and oil industries, led by the American Petroleum Institute, filed lawsuit against the implementation of the regulations. The act was passed in 2010. The regulations were promulgated by the Securities and Exchange Commission last year. The industry filed a lawsuit last year trying to block it, and that litigation proceeds today in the courts of the United States. In the meantime, after the SEC adopted those rules, the European Commission considered and has now adopted in the last few months rules that go even beyond those of the Cardin-Lugar Amendment, requiring European companies, list public or not, to disclose the same payments and indeed covering even a wider set of industries, including forestry. So these two sets of regulations, both new in the last 12 months, have the potential to really transform at least the transparency, if not the end of the corrupt practice themselves, the transparency of these payments, allowing domestic actors, international NGOs, others, journalists, to trace the funds and one hopes at least encourage their appropriate use. How did those two things happen? That was not a question. That was not an issue of a lot of voters becoming concerned about this, politicians deciding the appropriate thing to do would be to campaign on these issues, and the democratic process, as one learns about it in primary school, going forward. This was a concerted campaign on both sides by organized political forces. On the one side, the organized forces of the industry, and on the other side, a series of NGOs. Bono's One, George Soros's Open Society Foundations, were among the more prominent players in these lobbying debates, both in the United States and in Europe. But the NGOs themselves that were involved, Global Witness, the Revenue Watch Institute, Published What You Pay, a coalition of hundreds of organizations around the world, most of them located in resource-rich but income-poor countries. The lobbying by these groups was probably the dominant force, certainly as the G8 prepares to meet in the next month or two under the UK chairmanship. It will consider the same provisions applying even to wider, even beyond Europe and the United States. And there's the real possibility that within about a 2 or 3 year period, the requirement of companies to disclose these payments will become a new global norm, a legal norm and a global practice. And that represents the triumph of organized civil society working against corruption in really an extraordinary way. So there's a story, at least, about civil society and highly funded civil society working as a force against corruption. That is that can distract us, I think, sometimes, or lead to the misinterpretation of the kinds of laws that I mentioned at the beginning that really are about the second story I want to share. I am surprised often when I hear my colleagues in civil society and philanthropy and foundations talk about the anti-NGO laws in Russia, the newly proposed NGO law in Egypt, or their equivalent around the world, as if this is just obviously the extension of repressive politics, anti-democratic impulses aimed as a kind of evil force against the good of civil society. I think we miss the whole story if we see the laws in that respect. I think sometimes blinded by the noble work that is done against corruption, we miss actually the corrupting power of civil society and philanthropy in many of these places. It's not just, well, let's sort of review it a little bit. So in Russia, as you probably know, a series of laws, each one tighter than the one before, today require all NGOs receiving foreign funding and now with the most recent amendments engaged in any kind of political activity to register as foreign agents. And the phrase foreign agent is not just a descriptive phrase. It harkens back to Stalin's era when being accused as a foreign agent was about the worst thing that could happen to you. And to declare oneself a foreign agent is meant to recall that era and meant to vilify the people who have to describe themselves that way. And to support this requirement, there are right now being carried out, as you probably know from the press here in Berlin, a series of inspections of foreign-funded and foreign-affiliated NGOs in Russia, in which a whole phalanx of different agencies, inspectors from the MVD, from different ministries, arrive in a coordinated fashion at the offices of an NGO, look at the books, and otherwise carry out these inspections. Some of them have proceeded relatively benignly. Others are now beginning to result in prosecutions and certainly in requirements that certain NGOs register as foreign agents. That's the Russia story, and the foreign agent laws are the ones that are held up as the sort of epitome of what's wrong in this regulation. Two things are at play here. There is an attack on freedom of association, that is the right of people to form NGOs and work in this way within a society. And second is the attack on foreign funding itself. And it's important probably to distinguish those two parts of the story. But in most of the legislation I'll mention, regulation of those two things are combined. So for example, in the new law proposed by the newly elected government in Egypt, the new NGO law there combines these two elements, restricting any foreign funding, creating a new council, 4 members from government, 4 members from civil society of the government's choosing, and that 8-person council will have to review any proposed foreign funding, any domestic organization that wants to receive foreign funding, any international organization that wants to open an office in Egypt. All of these require permission from this council to go forward. The criteria the council's supposed to use in approving any of these operations is very loose. The same law increases the number of people who have to found any even domestic civil society organization in Egypt, and increases the amount of money an organization has to have before it can begin to engage, and restricts those organizations that want to engage in what they call public policy or public opinion activities. It's not just Egypt and Russia. In India, sometimes held out as a great example of democracy, the long-standing restrictions on foreign funding are being tightened up only in this last year, not just requiring any NGO or civil society organization receiving foreign funding to have a license to do so, but now requiring that license to be renewed every 5 years instead of the practice a couple of years ago of a one-time permission. In Zambia, in Africa, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, we see a series of legislative proposals that are restricting these same two things: how easy it is to form an NGO, and the activities the NGO or the civil society organization can participate in, and then separately foreign funding. It's not just in these parts of the world. Last year, the Canadian government increased dramatically the funds available to police the restrictions on foreign funding to Canadian organizations when members of the government denounced environmental groups in Canada for serving as vehicles for money laundering by foreign interests interested in subverting the Canadian process for approving mineral and other environmental projects. And so this talk against the corrupting role of foreign funding of NGOs, the corrupting role of NGOs in democracy, we are seeing today all over the world. And not to take it seriously, not to try and understand why why such laws are proliferating, not just in Russia, but similar politics in Canada, India, South Africa, what's happening here. Well, in one sense, what's happening is pretty obvious, right? If you've got a notion of democratic practice as about citizens in public debate and through elections determining the domestic policy of their countries, and if the role of money in politics, particularly large money assembled by would-be plutocrats, is precisely the threat to democracy and the corrupting force, then what foundations like the Open Society Foundations or others does in a lot of places could look like a pretty straightforward corruption. It is the deployment of these kinds of funds for public debate, public discourse, even domestically. Even a German foundation funding political activity within Germany could fall afoul of the same fear of corrupting the democratic process. And so it's not surprising that in many countries, including the United States, the regulation of how civil society organizations can engage in politics, how much they can do, and particularly focused on how money comes into that process, those kinds of restrictions exist almost everywhere. And in some ways, the logical extension of these, you can think of the Russian laws, the Indian laws, and others as the logical extension of these same restrictions. I think there's a clue, which will sort of segue into the third story about this. When you begin to look at the scandals in different countries. So the scandal in Egypt, the scandal in Russia, isn't about actually the Open Society Foundations. The Open Society Foundations support a large number of groups, not directly engaged in politics, but certainly engaged in the rule of law, in the expansion of democratic practice and public expression in Egypt and in much of North Africa and the Middle East. As far as we know so far, none of our grantees have run into trouble because of their receipt of our support. The people that have run into trouble aren't just NGOs receiving money from abroad. They're NGOs receiving money from abroad that originated or came through the United States government or other governmental sources. And indeed, because of growing the last several decades enthusiasm for government bilateral aid agencies to make use of NGOs as a vehicle for many of the governance reform programs, means that you don't just have a foreign NGO sending money to a domestic NGO in Egypt or Russia or Ethiopia. You have a government giving funds to an international NGO that then either tries to register to do work in the country or provides money to domestic NGOs. And so the involvement of government funds in that same flow changes the calculus, or it appears to at least change the calculus of those attacking. So it's the most visible attack in Russia are of NGOs receiving money not from a foreign philanthropist, though that's what the law says, but from USAID, whose offices were ordered closed by the government late last year. And in Egypt, the prosecutions, while they are prosecutions of foreign affiliated NGOs, have focused on those receiving funds or connected to the political establishments in the United States and Germany. So you have a worry not just about money in politics, but about foreign government money in politics that sharpens the issue. As far as I know, civil society foundations have not actually confronted the choice this clearly poses for us. Should we be making common cause with USAID, with the government-sponsored and chartered civil society organizations, asserting a right or at least a noble practice of trying to advance democratic practice and social engagement together with them, or should we be distinguishing the regulation that ought to be made between foreign governments' support of political civil society and private support of political civil society? Of course, the foreign money in question here does not just come down to let's call them sort of politically secular and liberal philanthropy or governments of various persuasions trying to support good governance in other countries. There are huge religious flows of philanthropy moving across these same borders. A huge amount of concern, for example, in Cuba today about evangelical, Pentecostal, and other funding flows coming in to support an array of social services, but work that's increasingly engaged in political affairs as well. So you have a variety of funds coming in. What is the issue? Is the issue for foundations and for civil society the importance of opening those channels or preserving channels of international support for civil society, and how inclusive do we want to make the case for the integrity of those flows? Final piece of this story that I don't have an answer for that question, but I would be very interested in your views about it. I am, as you can probably tell, nervous about building a case for permission or for the integrity of all foreign funding flows to civil society engaged in political advocacy. You can try and pretend it's not political. I think that argument, while it's often made, is hard to sustain. If you're helping people, if you're teaching people about campaign tactics, you can say, well, you're teaching everybody. But whatever you're doing, it's probably political, even if it's momentarily nonpartisan. So if it is political, at least in some broad definition of political, albeit nonpartisan, what are the non-corrupting forms that we think we're prepared to defend? But the third part of the story, which I think is actually crucial in trying to untangle the puzzles of the first two, is this, and it's really the story of the growing power, I think, of civil society in democratic practice. Moises Naim has a new book on he calls The End of Power, in which his argument is power is more easily attained today than ever before, more quickly lost, and it doesn't do you nearly the good it once did if you had it. Power, in short, isn't what it used to be. And the argument goes everything from corporate power and the brief life of most companies on Fortune 100 lists. The average lifespan there has been dramatically reduced in the last several years, but also the average lifespan of world chess champions at the top of their world rankings. His point is something is happening about the availability of information, about the nature of success, and about the power on top of various institutions. But his quintessential argument is that political parties don't have power in the way they used to, and his model for how political parties might think about rebuilding themselves are modern NGOs that he sees as more agile, more able to mobilize people, more able to connect with people's aspirations and interests. And that there's a power, a social power, a political power growing in NGOs that's disappearing virtually everywhere else in society. If you look at polling in the same countries that are passing all this legislation, it tells an interesting story. In India, in China, in Russia, NGOs are some of the most trusted institutions the public know about. They are, in India, for example, they rank with the army above all the democratic structures of the country. The more democratic you are in India, the lower the trust you register in public opinion polls. The judiciary is up there. About 65% of Indians say they have some confidence in judiciary. NGOs are at about 75%. And so I think are the third or fourth most widely trusted organizations. In China, you get very similar rankings, tremendous trust and confidence in civil society despite dramatic regulation. Though actually there's a little coda to the story, the second story. China may be one of the only countries in the world that is currently liberalizing its regulation of NGOs rather than narrowing it or restricting it. That said, the regulation of NGOs in China remains quite strict. But the point is that the very structures that are being so feared as sources of corruption in a kind of democratic, sort of formal politics, seem to have resonance, seem to be able to capture the trust and confidence of people. And even, at least for some political scientists, seem to be models of modern organization that others might emulate. This was brought home to me on a recent visit to NGO, some politically inclined NGOs in Tunisia. One group with which I met on a recent visit there started essentially as a social movement, a small number of activists gathering together, forming themselves into a loosely structured but formally registered NGO, and essentially turning up at parliamentary debates and reporting on what was actually said in Parliament and broadcasting it through social media to a surprisingly broad audience across Tunisia, to the point where when they now walk into the public gallery in the Parliament in Tunisia, it's usually commented upon by the parliamentarians in active debate that they're now present and everyone should be on better behavior. This particular NGO has become, in short, a political force to be reckoned with in Tunisia. And its founder has described to me the debate they had about whether or not to accept funding, and that meant, to a large extent, foreign funding for the organization. And what she said is that the lesson that she drew from across the countries of the so-called Arab Spring was that what mattered in consolidating revolutionary progress was organization. The winners in the Arab Spring were not the people with the best ideas or even the people who could turn out the largest crowds in the streets. They were the people who were organized. And organization, in that sense, matters crucially for democratic practice and democratic progress. And if that's true, it's a fundamental correction to the idea of democracy lying in individual voices, individual voters, a sort of atomistic vision of what of democratic practice, and therefore a different perspective on what corruption looks like. If corruption, if democratic practice looks like organization, as opposed to looking like individual voters lining up to go into a polling booth, then the role of funding and the role of civil society organizations looks fundamentally different. Instead of standing apart from core politics, influencing it, it is core politics. It is democratic practice. It's not an effort to influence democratic practice. And if that's what we see civil society as and these organizational structures as, then I think it is a more powerful platform from which to criticize and critique the restriction of NGO activity domestically or internationally. That was her point to me. She said, you know, people say we're losing our power by becoming salaried. But she said, actually, we are consolidating our power by becoming salaried. We are going to be able to last. We are going to be able to be a part of the political story in this country as opposed to fading, as so many of our colleagues have across various borders. I think that some frame like that is necessary from which to understand and defend the organization of civil society and the act of essentially more, at least politically conscious or more politically attuned philanthropy than simply an attack on all regulation of civil society. So I end where I started. Philanthropy, we have to understand that philanthropy can be corrupting. It can, like statistics being able to lie, philanthropy can corrupt. And the regulation of it is probably inevitable and perhaps a good thing. Some of those debates are around the sources and the nature of that philanthropy. And yet, civil society, it seems to me, is not distorting democracy when it gets engaged. It is democratic practice, and from that perspective, I think we have to build a set of regulations and a perspective on the role of philanthropy in politics that sees it not as a form of corruption, but indeed an antidote to it. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.